Gloucester, England, 1994. For years, rumors had swirled around the mid-terrace house at 25 Cromwell Street. It was a place of loud music, strange visitors, and a revolving door of foster children and lodgers. But when police began investigating the disappearance of the West's own daughter, Heather, they uncovered a secret that would traumatize the nation. Beneath the floorboards and under the concrete of the garden patio, investigators didn't find one body, they found a graveyard. As the excavation widened, it became clear that this was not just the work of a lone madman, it was a partnership. At the center of this web was Rosemary West, a woman who had mastered the art of appearing like a busy mother while presiding over a literal house of horrors.
Rosemary West was just 15 years old when she met 27-year-old Fred West at a bus stop in Cheltenham in 1968. Fred was already a man with a violent past, having likely committed his first murders in the mid-60s. Rosemary, coming from a troubled home with an abusive father, was quickly drawn into Fred's world of deviance. Their relationship was built on a foundation of shared sexual fantasies and a total lack of empathy. By the time they married in 1972, they had established a dynamic where Rosemary was not merely an accomplice, but often the primary instigator of violence. Together, they began a decades-long spree of luring young women, often drifters, runaways, or their own children, into their home under the guise of offering a room or a job. The crimes at 25 Cromwell Street followed a chillingly routine pattern. The Wests targeted vulnerable young women, some as young as 15. Once inside the house, the victims were subjected to prolonged periods of sexual assault and torture. Rosemary played a crucial role in these sessions. She would often act as the friendly face that lured the victims into a false sense of security before the violence began. Evidence later revealed that she was frequently more aggressive than Fred, using her position as a mother to manipulate the victims. When the victims were no longer of use, they were murdered and dismembered. Fred, who had worked in construction, used his skills to hide the remains in the cellar, under the kitchen floor, and in the garden, sealing them behind fresh brickwork and concrete. The most harrowing aspect of the West case was their willingness to turn their predatory instincts toward their own blood. In 1971, while Fred was in prison, Rosemary murdered Fred's stepdaughter, Charmaine, while the girl was under her care. She buried the 8-year-old under the floorboards of their previous home in Midland Road. Years later, in 1987, their own eldest daughter, Heather, vanished. When siblings asked where she had gone, the Wests claimed she had run away to start a new life. In reality, Heather had become a victim of her parents' depravity. She was murdered and buried in the garden, topped with a patio where the family would later hold barbecues. This ability to maintain a normal family life atop the graves of their own children is what defines Rosemary West's unique brand of psychopathy. The House of Cards collapsed in February 1994. Police, acting on a tip regarding Heather's disappearance, obtained a search warrant. When the first bones were found in the garden, Fred and Rosemary were arrested. Initially, Fred attempted to take the blame for all the murders, hoping to protect Rosemary so she could continue to look after their remaining children. However, as forensic evidence mounted, Fred's story fell apart. In a final act of cowardice, Fred West hanged himself in his prison cell on New Year's Day 1995 before he could stand trial. This left Rosemary to face justice alone. She denied everything, portraying herself as a victim of Fred's influence, claiming she had no knowledge of the bodies buried inches beneath her feet. The prosecution, however, produced evidence of her active participation in the torture and her independent killings while Fred was away. The trial of Rosemary West at Winchester Crown Court was one of the most expensive and high-profile in British history. Over 100 witnesses testified, including her own surviving children, who spoke of a household defined by extreme physical and sexual abuse. The jury heard how Rosemary had independently solicited victims and had been the sole killer in the case of Charmaine West. Her defense of domestic ignorance was shattered by the sheer geography of the house. It was impossible to live in such a small space and not know that the floors were being ripped up and the cellar was being filled with human remains. In November 1995, she was found guilty of 10 counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a whole life tariff. Rosemary West remains one of only a few women in the UK to be told she will die in prison. After her conviction, 25 Cromwell Street was demolished by the city council to prevent it from becoming a ghoulish shrine. The site was turned into a public footpath, erasing the physical structure but not the memory of what happened there. Her case forced a massive reevaluation of how social services and police handle missing persons and domestic abuse reports. Rosemary West serves as a terrifying reminder that the most horrific crimes aren't always committed by monsters in the woods, but can happen in the house next door, behind a tidy lace curtain, perpetrated by a woman the world assumed was a mother first and a predator second. Belgium, August 1996. For over a year, the country had been gripped by the disappearance of several young girls. The atmosphere was thick with dread. On August 13th, acting on a tip regarding a silver van, police raided a nondescript house in Marcinelle, owned by a convicted kidnapper named Marc Dutroux. What they found behind a heavy wooden shelf in the basement was a secret soundproofed cell. Inside, huddled in the dark, were two girls, Sabine Dardenne and Laetitia Delhez, who had been missing for weeks and days, respectively. But the relief of their rescue was quickly overshadowed by a harrowing question: what had happened to the others? This discovery was the beginning of a scandal that would bring the Belgian government to its knees and reveal a nightmare hidden in the heart of Europe. To understand the outrage that followed, one must look at Dutroux's past. In 1989, he had been sentenced to 13 years in prison for the abduction and sexual assault of 5 young girls. He was a known predator, a high-risk recidivist. Yet in 1992, he was released on parole after serving only 3 years, despite warnings from psychiatric experts. Once free, Dutroux didn't reform. He expanded. He began building a network of safe houses and secret compartments. He lived a double life as a petty thief and electrician, while systematically preparing for a spree of abductions that would target the most vulnerable members of society. The fact that a man with his record was free to roam the streets became the focal point of a nation's fury. The darkest chapter of the Dutroux saga began in June 1995. 2 8-year-old girls, Julie Lejeune and Melissa Rousseau, disappeared while playing near a bridge in Grace-Hollogne. For months, their parents led a desperate, highly publicized campaign to find them. Police surveillance was placed on Dutroux during this time, but in a series of catastrophic blunders, investigators failed to search the basement of his Marcinelle home thoroughly. At one point, a police officer even heard children's voices through a wall, but dismissed it as coming from the street. While Dutroux was briefly imprisoned for a separate car theft charge in late 1995, Julie and Melissa were trapped in the basement cell, eventually starving to death while their captor sat in a jail cell only a few miles away. Dutroux did not act alone. His wife, Michelle Martin, was an active participant in his crimes, later admitting she had failed to feed Julie and Melissa while Dutroux was in prison, leading to their deaths. The investigation also pointed toward a larger network, including a man named Michel Nihoul, a businessman with alleged ties to the Belgian elite. The involvement of Nihoul sparked a massive wave of conspiracy theories. The public began to believe that Dutroux was not just a lone predator, but a provider for a high-level pedophile ring protected by people in positions of power. While many of these claims were never proven in court, the incompetence of the police, who lost files, ignored leads, and engaged in turf wars between different departments, fueled the belief that a cover-up was in progress. Following the rescue of Sabine and Laetitia, the bodies of Julie, Melissa, and 2 other teenagers, and Marshall and Yves G. Lambrex, were recovered from Dutroux's properties. The grief of the families turned into a national uprising when the lead investigator, Jean-Marc Connerat, was removed from the case on a technicality. The people of Belgium reached a breaking point. In October 1996, over 300,000 people marched through the streets of Brussels in what became known as the White March. Protesters carried white balloons and flowers, symbolizing innocence, and demanded a total reform of the Belgian justice system. It remains the largest public demonstration in the country's history, forcing the government to abolish the separate gendarmerie and judicial police forces to create a unified, more transparent police system. The trial of Marc Dutroux did not begin until 2004, 8 years after his arrest. The delay was a source of constant pain for the victims' families. Dutroux used the courtroom as a stage, attempting to portray himself as a victim of a larger conspiracy or a subcontractor for more powerful men. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming. The testimonies of the survivors, Sabine Dardenne and Laetitia Delhez, were particularly powerful. Sabine, who had spent 80 days in the basement cell, looked Dutroux in the eye and asked, "Why didn't you kill me?" In June 2004, Dutroux was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. Michel Martin received 30 years, and Nioul was convicted of conspiracy but cleared of the abductions themselves. Marc Dutroux remains in a high-security prison today, one of the most hated men in Europe. The Dutroux affair fundamentally changed Belgium. It led to the Octopus Agreement, which overhauled the country's police and judiciary, and birthed Child Focus, a leading European organization for missing and sexually exploited children. But for the families of the victims, the reforms were a small consolation for the lives lost due to bureaucratic negligence. The house in Marcinelle was eventually demolished and turned into a memorial garden. The case of Marc Dutroux serves as a haunting reminder of the darkness that can exist in the heart of a peaceful society and the devastating cost when the systems meant to protect us fail to look behind the shelf. Manchester, 1963. The city was on the cusp of a cultural revolution, but in the industrial suburbs of Gorton, a different kind of revolution was taking place in the minds of two office workers. Myra Hindley was a 21-year-old typist, a woman described by co-workers as quiet and unremarkable. That changed the moment she met Ian Brady, a stock clerk with an obsession with Nazi philosophy and the writings of the Marquis de Sade. To the outside world, they were a mundane couple, but behind closed doors, Brady was molding Hindley into his perfect accomplice. He didn't just want a partner, he wanted a witness and a participant in his descent into nihilism. By the summer of 1963, the couple had moved beyond dark fantasies and began scouting for their first victim. They chose a place that would become synonymous with their names, the bleak, windswept expanse of Saddleworth Moor. The Moors' murders began in July 1963. Their first victim was 16-year-old Pauline Reed. Hindley's role was crucial. She was the lure. She would drive the car and approach victims, using her appearance as a young, non-threatening woman to bypass the natural defenses of children and teenagers. In November 1963, they abducted 12-year-old John Kilbride from a market. The pattern was always the same. Hindley would lure the child into the car under a false pretext. Brady would commit the murder, and together they would bury the bodies in shallow, unmarked graves on the moors. Hindley wasn't a passive observer. She was the logistics officer of their campaign, providing the transportation, the alibis, and the mask of normalcy that kept them invisible to the police for over 2 years. The most harrowing evidence of the duo's depravity came from the abduction of 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey in 1964. Inside their home at 16 Wardlebrook Avenue, the couple recorded the child's final moments on a reel-to-reels tape recorder. The audio captured the sounds of Leslie Ann pleading for her life while Hindley told her to shut up. Hindley also posed for a series of photographs on Saddleworth Moor. In these images, she is seen holding a dog, looking directly at the camera with a chillingly blank expression. After their arrest, investigators realized these photos weren't just vacation snapshots, they were markers. Hindley was posing directly over the spots where she and Brady had buried their victims. This level of calculation and coldness shattered the contemporary British belief that women were incapable of such premeditated cruelty. The spree ended in October 1965 because of a witness. Ian Brady brought Hindley's 17-year-old brother-in-law, David Smith, to their house to witness the murder of 17-year-old Edward Evans. Brady likely believed that by involving Smith, he would gain a new disciple. Instead, Smith was horrified. After being forced to help move the body, he fled the house and went straight to the police. When officers raided the home, they found Edward Evans' body in a bedroom. Hindley was found calmly sitting in the kitchen, drinking tea. As the search intensified, police found a suitcase at a railway station containing the tape recording and the photographs that would lead them to the moors. The recovery of the bodies transformed a local missing persons case into a national trauma. The trial at Chester Assizes in 1966 was a media circus. She pleaded not guilty to all charges, maintaining that she was under Brady's hypnotic influence and acted out of fear. The prosecution dismantled this defense by playing the tape recording of Leslie Ann Downey in open court. The jury heard Hindley's voice, not fearful, but commanding and cold. In May 1966, both were sentenced to life imprisonment. At the time, the death penalty had only recently been abolished in the UK. Otherwise, it is almost certain they would have been executed. Hindley became the most hated woman in Britain, a title she would hold for the rest of her life. For the next 3 decades, Hindley launched a tireless campaign for parole. She transformed her image, claiming she had found religion and was a reformed woman. She eventually confessed to her full involvement in the murders in the late 1980s, assisting police in a final search of the moors to find the body of Pauline Reed. However, the body of one victim, Keith Bennett, was never found. Hindley's refusal or inability to provide the exact location of his grave meant that public sentiment remained resolutely against her release. Successive Home Secretaries ruled that life must mean life for Hindley, citing the exceptional gravity of her crimes. She became a political lightning rod, with her potential release sparking riots and fierce debates about the nature of redemption. Myra Hindley died in prison in November 2002 at the age of 60. She had spent 36 years behind bars, making her one of the longest-serving female prisoners in British history. Even in death, she remained a polarizing figure. No funeral home in Cambridge wanted to handle her remains, and her cremation had to be conducted under a heavy police guard. The case of the Moors murders remains a scar on the British psyche. It prompted a re-evaluation of how police handle missing children and led to the creation of more sophisticated forensic profiling. Myra Hindley's legacy is one of absolute betrayal, not just of the children she helped kill, but of the societal expectation of female compassion. She remains the face of a darkness that even decades later, the world struggled